Welcome to Plain Civics. Thank you for joining us. I'm Joe Ulery.
And I'm Bobbi Fisher.
Our goal is to break down how government works so you can make the government work for you. Welcome to today's episode. And Bobbi, I'll just mention real quick here at the top of the episode that we do have a special statement that we will be making at the end of this podcast after the pop quiz. It bridges us into episode 20, which follows this one, so stay tuned for that. Let's jump right into the Fast Five.
The Fast Five.
And today I'm asking Bobbi the questions. Here we go.
I'm ready.
All right. Number one, do you consider yourself more of a risk taker or a cautious planner?
I would say I'm a cautious planner. I think that goes along with the Virgo thing, but I can't say I've never taken a risk, but I usually try to think and plan.
It's the teacher in you too.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
What's the most embarrassing fashion trend you've ever followed?
I actually busted out laughing when I read this question, and my answer is, me, fashion. Look at me. I wear T-shirts and jeans now that I'm retired most of the time.
That comes with
my
the
T-shirts
territory.
have a message. And as far as I know, T-shirts with messages have always been in fashion.
That's always cool. What is the most rebellious thing you did as a teenager?
When I was a sophomore in high school, my boyfriend and I ran away. And we actually got as far as Kentucky. He eventually became my husband, and now we're divorced. But yeah.
Wow.
It was like not even 24 hours.
Oh, yeah.
But
Wow.
and I was not a bad kid. I was influenced.
If you could give your younger self career advice, what would it be?
My thing would be, don't get married before you get where you want to be. Experience college, experience things, and the marriage stuff will still be there if it's intended.
Meant to be, yeah.
And I think that I would have been happier in the long run if I'd have gone along with that advice.
Question 5, Bobbi. What motivates you? Now, I'm asking this question as I overslept today and couldn't drag myself out of bed to get here to record. What motivates you to keep going?
Sometimes it's very difficult, especially in this day and age. I'll just put it that way. But facts and truth must be made available, and teaching is my life. And so I think that pushes me to do what we're doing and to keep going and trying to put the information out there in a truthful way.
All right, so let's get to work here today, Bobbi, and let's get started.
And now our feature presentation.
Political polarization, or why can't we all just get along? If you're paying any attention at all, one of the major problems in American government and politics today is political polarization. This is not an opinion of ours. It's backed up by numerous studies done by nonpartisan think tanks, higher education research centers, general experts in the field, media. I mean, just, if you follow along, you can see that. In keeping with our nonpartisan, non-political mantra, please understand that what we are discussing today in this podcast does not express our views, but the results of many of the studies done in recent years. And I would add to that, a couple of examples that I use are from today, just because I figured those would be most relevant and people would be, if they are paying any attention, more familiar with those. So I've tried to apply them based on, the topic that we're talking about. So what do we mean by political polarization? Political polarization happens basically when political ideology and attitudes move further and further away from the center toward the ideological extremes. Many times you hear this as moving left or right, or even far left or far right. It's often associated with political parties and democratic systems of government. In our two-party political system, the Republicans or conservative ideals are considered to be the right of center, and democratic or liberal ideas are considered to be to the left of center. So what I used to use when I was teaching is visualize this, if you can, since we're not on video or anything, visualize a number line where the central point on the line is 0. If you move to the right of the 0 point, the line goes all the way to 100, and we'll just stop it there. And if you go to the left of the 0 point, the line goes also all the way to 100. And the 0 point in the middle of the number line represents complete agreement in this ideological setting. So in varying degrees, moving either to the right or the left of the 0 point, beliefs start to differ, moving from moderate, which is the center, to extreme, which would be to the far right and the far left, with 100, the endpoint 100 to either the left or the right being the most extreme, or the farthest to the extreme. So each of us, each person's beliefs fall somewhere on this linear model, and then they might fall differently depending on what the topic is. At least if you're being honest with yourself.
Yeah.
So here's an example of how to put this linear model to work to get you to think about it. Let's look at the issue of abortion, for example. People who would completely outlaw abortion, no questions asked, no reason for exception to be considered, would be considered at the extreme right on that linear model. Someone who believes there should be absolutely no restrictive laws against abortion would be at the extreme left. Polls show that in the United States right now, a majority of people are actually somewhere in the middle or just a little right or left of zero, or the center moderate line, meaning that most Americans do not believe in no restrictions at all or absolutely no exceptions at all. Again, I'm using this example of abortion as a simplified explanation of how we can visualize and think of what people mean when they are talking about polarization on an issue. What causes polarization to happen? There are various causes of political polarization today, and they maybe haven't always been the same, but some of these causes would be political parties, current political and or social issues such as like what I just used, abortion, or another recent one, redistricting or gerrymandering. So like I said, the issues may change from time to time. The public's political ideology, mass media, and politicization. So let's stop there and look at politicization, defined as the process by which decisions within an agency or a program or the government are made based on political considerations rather than technical or scientific factors, often leading to actions taken solely to express a partisan political position. And this may actually be one of the biggest reasons for political polarization today and the last few years. For example, and again, this is just an example I'm taking from that's in the news that people might be able to relate to. When looking at recent decisions by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC, it seems that leaders on the administrative side are being driven by their personal beliefs to push certain decisions rather than allowing the scientists who are in the trenches doing the medical research and scientific research and studies guide the decisions that affect public health. One example in the news right now is the current Secretary of Health and Human Services, who is neither a scientist or a doctor, taking the lead in determining who should and should not be allowed to receive certain vaccines and whether there should be further funding and development of more and better vaccines. The guidance on this decision is better left to the experts, which are the scientists and the doctors, but because of a fringe conspiracy group that makes unproven claims about vaccines, and I say unproven, but they may also be claims that have been proven to be false, but they make these claims about vaccines causing certain health problems or death, for example, the political leadership decides to cater to the whims of the fringe group rather than to allow decisions based on the scientific research and the experts. This is a great example of politicizing an issue, in this case, vaccines. Another way would be to cut funding for vaccine research and development to get more and better vaccines because of a small fringe anti-vax group's pressure on leadership that is determined within the political system. So even though the agency the Secretary of Health and Human Services is leading is meant to do what is best for the common good, the Secretary makes sure the guidance coming from the department favors the fringe beliefs, not the common good. So allowing government agencies that directly serve the health and well-being of the American citizens to be politicized comes at the detriment or the disadvantage of we the people. When it comes to the health and well-being of the citizens, decisions made in favor of political desires rather than science and common sense could have a disastrous effect on the citizens. It could mean the difference between life and death or the type of life someone may live. All of this causes disinformation and confusion to abound in society, which keeps this in the news where it often creates even more polarization among the people. Some of the other causes often attributed to political polarization include the influence that so-called high information citizens have over the approximately 35% of American citizens who are considered low information. We talked about this issue of low information citizens in a couple of our previous episodes, especially in relation to the lack of voting on their part. Often they don't vote because they lack information about issues, which means the high information voters, who often hold strong opinions on issues, have much more influence on candidates and legislation that's passed. We talked about voting just a couple episodes ago. Also, because primary elections in some states are closed to non-party affiliated voters, which that means that a voter that hasn't declared whether they're a Democrat or Republican. In some states, they're not allowed to vote in primary elections. So that means only people affiliated with one of the political parties gets to vote. So independent voters are shut out of those primaries, and that means those who are able to vote tend to be more ideological, extreme, and polarized rather than the moderate, non-affiliated independent voters are. Another cause that has contributed to polarization can be shown to be related to the Supreme Court decision in the 2010 Citizens United case, which critics predicted would, quote, bring about a new era of corporate influence in politics, end quote, allowing companies to, quote, buy elections, end quote, to promote their financial interest. Instead, large expenditures, usually through super PACs, have come from a small group of billionaires based largely on ideology. So these are the people trying to get their certain agendas pushed through into legislation. Since the Citizens United decision, outside spending on campaigns has continuously increased. Most of this money was spent by super PACs, whose creation is attributed to this ruling. Now, I hate to give out a lot of statistics and stuff, but I think we have to do that for comparison.
Yeah.
So, for example, during the 2008 election cycle, that was the last election before the Citizens United ruling, outside spending accounted for $574 million of all election spending. By 2020, outside spending reached $3.3 billion and came close to $4.5 billion in the 2024 election. Most of that money was spent by super PACs. In the 2024 election, 8 of the top 10 largest donors contributed to Republican candidates, which likely helped Republicans gain control of both houses of Congress and the presidency. Also affecting polarization are issues like gerrymandering, which we discussed in our last episode, episode 18. Also continued racial and immigration divisions, which of course immigration is a huge controversial issue right now. Differing education levels, which we talked about in a couple previous episodes. Also a lack of civics education, we've also talked about. Economic inequality, which seems to be getting worse and worse. And the media. We have discussed some of these issues in recent episodes, including the media, but I want to stress some factors about the current state of media because the changing media sphere is quite possibly the biggest driver of political polarization. More partisan media groups have emerged in blogs, podcasts, talk radio, websites, and cable news channels, and they're much more likely to use insulting language, mockery, and extremely dramatic reactions, collectively referred to as outrage. People who have strongly partisan viewpoints are more likely to watch partisan news. Unlike the way it was until about 30 years ago, these media outlets are available 24/7. They don't sign off at midnight and go blank like they used to. Media companies use big data algorithms to personalize content creation and manipulate viewers, listeners, and users. Because some users either lack the education on how to sort through all of this media bombarding them 24/7, or just don't make an effort to investigate its legitimacy, many take it at face value and make it their own. And if you don't understand that or need help, go back to our episode 6 where we talk about media literacy and trying to sort through information. I also wanted to stop here and just take a minute. Yesterday I heard a term I hadn't really thought about before in regards to cognitive bias or being influenced by the one side or the other. And they use the term zero-sum thinking, kind of like a winner takes all and gets control, or success is only possible at the expense of others. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit more later on, but that's kind of like we're in our silos.
Yes.
And it's like, it's this way or no way.
I think we can all be better about that.
Right.
I'm pointing the finger back at myself on that as well.
And it's kind of like if you think of zero-sum thinking, it's like with abortion. Most of us are actually in the middle.
Yes.
So why does it have to be, it all has to be taken away?
Right.
Or, that's zero-sum thinking because you want to win that point. Okay, so back to political polarization. There are actually two types of political polarization. One is called ideological polarization. So that's our differences between actual policy positions, and affective polarization, which is the dislike and distrust of political outgroups. So the U.S. has seen a greater growth of both types of polarization since about the end of the 20th century, and actually more than other comparable democracies. We've seen this growth of these two types of polarization. Differences in political ideals and policy goals are indicative of a healthy democracy. And I'm going to discuss what's needed for a healthy democracy later, but I want to stop there.
Okay.
Think about that again. Differences in political ideals and policy goals are indicative of a healthy democracy. In other words, we need to have different ideas. And if you think back to if you listen to our episodes on the Constitutional Convention, or just think about what you learned probably back in school about how Congress is supposed to work. We have two political parties with different ideas, but what we hope is that each side can present certain things, and maybe one side will say, okay, yeah, I see that. And they can come together through some civil discourse and reach a consensus or some kind of compromise. Not this, oh no, it has to be this way, and we're not going to...
It's constant attack mode.
Right.
Maybe, Bobby, when you were a teacher, you saw this. Maybe not, but I kind of remember it from the classroom. It's like somebody who had a different opinion would, for one time, raise their hand and offer it, and people, if they immediately attack that person, eventually that person's going to lose their courage to participate in an effective conversation, and that voice gets diminished. And that's not the way it should be.
Exactly.
Everybody has a chair at the table.
And so for us to have a healthy democracy, we need people with different ideas. We just need to stop attacking each other and listen, which is what we're going to get to eventually. That takes us to when the differences become extreme, that's when it becomes polarization. So kind of like what you're talking about, when we are in our silos and we're just not going to move out of them, that's when we're polarized. We have to have the conversation and the civil discourse.
I mean, we have to be open to not always being right and most informed on a topic, or you aren't living in reality.
You can't think of it as a contest and somebody has to win and somebody has to lose. We all need to be able to win.
And it's a constant dialogue.
Right. So some of the current ideological issues that citizens and politicians may have differences about in our country right now are things like climate change, abortion, which I mentioned earlier, gay marriage, gun policies, the economy, healthcare, welfare, religion, and immigration, and that's just naming a few, but those are probably, I would say, the big issues right now. Polarization among U.S. legislators since the end of the 20th century is unbalanced, and it's become primarily driven by a rightward shift among Republicans in Congress. And this is proven. This, again, as I mentioned earlier, this isn't my opinion or your opinion. This is based on studies that have been done by nonpartisan groups. For example, according to Pew Research Center, members of both parties who have unfavorable opinions of the opposing party have doubled since 1994, while those who have very unfavorable opinions of the opposing party were at record highs as of 2022.
And I look at this 10,000 feet and think, Joe, what's changed since 1994, and I have to guess it's the internet.
Internet and media.
Yep,
Yes,
the internet, and there's constant influence, like you mentioned earlier. Anyone can have a podcast,
Social
anyone can have a
media,
blog, we're too easily influenced with.
Exactly.
And I would encourage people, as Bobbi names the statistics, please on your own Google Pew and look them up to see that they are legitimate and that we are giving facts that are from a company that has vetted the information. They're not trying to skew one way or the other. We encourage that.
And actually, I have a 2025 Gallup poll said the percentage of Americans self-identifying as politically moderate reached a record low of 34%. So that's from this year. And so if you think back to that imaginary linear line I talked about earlier on, there's only a third of us that are somewhere in that moderate range. That means the rest of the other 2/3 are somewhere out there, maybe even all the way to the far left or far right, or somewhere in between. And I've actually, since I did this research, I've heard and read at least 2 or 3 different times some other statistics that say the same. Because there are not as many of us in the middle or moderate as there used to be, there has to be a reason for that. And we need to come to some identification of that and some fixes, because we need to be more towards the middle in order to have that collaboration and have a healthy democracy and discussions and compromise.
Yeah, and I've found in my life, I'm putting myself under the microscope because I'm not happy with where we are in America. This is not the American ideal I think that any of us are striving for, is where we're at right now. So when I sit out in the driveway with my neighbors, we all come at it from different feelings about issues, and we don't necessarily discuss them, but they see me and I see them, and we're face to face and we have conversations. And you know what? When you're not behind a keyboard at a screen and you're sitting next to somebody who's 85 and feels differently, you are not as mean. I'm not as mean.
Right.
We need to see each other's face again. We need to interact at a human level and see each other as equals.
And I point that out somewhere in
It's
here
coming.
about, you know, hiding behind the screen or the keyboard.
Warriors, yeah.
On some of the issues with a wide public consensus, partisan politics still divides citizens. For instance, even though 60% of Americans believe that the government should provide health care for its citizens, opinions are split among party lines, with 85% of Democrats, including left-leaning independents, believing that health care is the government's responsibility, and 68% of Republicans believing that it's not the government's responsibility. Likewise, on some prominent issues where the parties are broadly split, there is bipartisan support for specific policies. Several studies show, for example, 79% of Americans think pre-existing conditions should be covered by health insurance. I used abortion as an example earlier, and it's interesting to note that, and this is based on a June 2025 Pew Research poll, that overall 63% of Americans believe abortion should be legal in most cases, with 36% believing it should be illegal in most cases. That's a pretty big difference.
Yeah.
And there has to be some kind of compromise that can be reached.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the same research shows that when we compare all Democrats and Republicans on abortion, 85% of Democrats and 41% of Republicans think abortion should be legal in most cases, which that kind of surprised me. That not that it was that big of a difference, but that even on the Republican side that it was that high.
Which shows room for compromise.
Exactly. 14% of Democrats and 57% of Republicans believe abortion should be illegal in most cases. Finally, when moderate Democrats and Republicans were polled, the numbers were much closer, with 76% of Democrats and 67% of Republicans in favor of abortions in most cases, and 23% of Democrats and 31% of Republicans believing that abortion should be illegal in most cases.
But those highest numbers that's only a 9-point difference.
Right.
So despite what you hear, we are closer on a lot of topics than we remember.
And if people would just get out of their silos
Go
and have a
outside.
discussion,
Yes.
we might be able to solve some of these issues. Some other statistics are 77% of Americans think legal immigration is good for the country. On gun rights, 89% support more mental health funding, 83% support closing the gun show loophole, 72% support red flag laws, and 72% support requiring gun permits when purchasing. In the federal budget, there is 80% or more support to retain funding for veterans, infrastructure, which is roads and bridges, Social Security, Medicare, and education. These are all examples of ideological polarization. But again, if we're looking at 80% support for some of those last ones, especially that I mentioned, why are we having so much trouble passing legislation to support those things and to not take them away?
And I think the answer to that is we are, not we, but our elected officials are focusing on the fringe topics and not things that we agree on that they could button up and lock down.
Again, something I've seen and heard recently that made me think of this is we almost have 365 days a year, every year election cycle going on anymore. It's like they're always running for re-election.
Yes.
It's like, it used to be like when it was presidential election, you didn't start hearing about that until like within the year before the actual election.
Right.
Now we hear,
It's
so-and-so is going to, run for president 3 years from now, or actual legislators themselves, which I realize representatives do have to be reelected every 2 years, but it's like they're
Constant election mode.
constant, yes. And it's like, no wonder they don't have time to legislate.
And I think a lot of them look for these social media moments. A lot of it's performative, and I see it day in and day out. And another thing with that 365 constant election mode is that money that the billions of dollars that get funneled into these parties to support candidates that we don't necessarily know where it's coming from, but that money's got to be spent. So it's year round. We're spending
Right.
to influence.
And we can't fix it, but we can offer some suggestions.
Yes. Hopefully.
And we can hope for them.
There's hope.
Right. So what happens when people increasingly identify with their political party as a core part of their identity, leading to stronger in-group loyalty and out-group hostility? And this is where we look at effective polarization. And keep in mind, these are the ideological and the effective are related. Okay, there's no getting around
Right.
that, because how you feel about certain issues is obviously going to affect your political identity, or the other way around, I guess. The emotional dislike and animosity between opposing political groups grows. Social media and partisan media outlets often reinforce existing beliefs and limit exposure to diverse perspectives, and that contributes to polarization. Political polarization significantly impacts society by exacerbating social divisions and fostering the us versus them mentality. So that's why I said earlier, like, you're in your silo here, I'm over here, it's me against you or us against them, and we want to win instead of we want to work things out.
I also think it's important that we self-reflect to really question ourselves, that there is a difference between how we truly feel and how we're told to feel.
Right. And I think also in there is somewhat this idea, and we haven't talked about it a lot, but that people feel like, okay, if I'm a Democrat or Republican, I can only vote for a Democrat or I can only vote for a Republican. I can't say, I'm just going to say, okay, let's say I'm a Republican. Mm-hmm. I can't look at that candidate and say, I really don't agree with their views, and I think they're really far out there, but I'm a Republican. I have to vote for them anyway.
No choice, yeah.
It's not really supposed to be that way.
Well, we go back to our founding fathers who did not want political parties.
So that, again, is also part of that.
It's downfall.
It is. What we end up with is with this us versus them mentality, which leads to decreased trust in institutions like our government, and between individuals. That's effective polarization. The heightened animosity and distrust can escalate into violence or threats of violence. In fact, at the time I was finalizing the notes for this episode, conservative political activist Charlie Kirk was shot and killed on a college campus in Utah. At the time, the killer was still on the loose and the motive was unknown. However, he was caught within about 30 hours after that. And we still don't know a whole lot about his motives. They haven't divulged a lot, but most believe that Kirk's killing was politically motivated. Time will tell. But in our current polarized America, it's highly likely that it was politically motivated.
And I just want to jump in here and make it perfectly clear so no one listens to this podcast and walks away with a question. My personal belief is there is never an instance where anyone should take anyone's life, another life. That's not our job.
Exactly.
That's wrong, and I don't care who's responsible. It's wrong, and I certainly do not endorse that.
Absolutely. On the same day, sadly, that Charlie Kirk was killed, there was another school shooting in Colorado.
Yep.
However, there was hardly any press coverage of that school shooting, which I kind of wrote in the margins here. Is that because we're just numb to the school shootings because there seem to be so many, or because the media thought it was better to play up the outrage over the shooting and killing of Charlie Kirk? I mean, those are questions that went through.
Those are valid questions.
My mind. Why wasn't the school shooting talked about more?
There were lives affected in that,
Exactly.
just as well. People cried at the end of the day. People's lives were forever changed, just as they were with Charlie Kirk. He had a wife, he had kids, and they have to deal with that the rest of their life. We really have to look at how we're talking about things and not just play for the number and the audience.
Exactly. How are we ever going to solve these types of violence if we can't talk to one another and trust each other? These deep political divisions hinder compromise and cooperation in government amongst friends and so forth. And in the government, it leads to more legislative gridlock, which means they, have difficulty passing needed legislation. Can also harm mental and physical health, contributing to stress, anxiety, and even physical health problems. And I can speak for myself. I know because I do follow politics and the news so closely that this is a real thing. Some days I'm completely stressed out and I just have to tune out for a while. Otherwise, it's going to drive me crazy.
It's rough lately. Some days we can't get out of bed. I don't want to get out of bed because of the day ahead.
And I want things to be solved, but there's only so much we can do about it. We want to see the people that are in those positions take the lead to try to help fix the problems.
Yes.
But these problems lead to an overall weakening of the democratic process because polarization undermines the norms of tolerance and moderation necessary for a healthy democracy. So that's kind of getting back to these are things we can fix. Our leaders can fix them. People increasingly associate with those who share their political views, leading to social segregation and reinforcing polarization. The us versus them mentality makes it difficult for people to find common ground and work together on shared challenges. In essence, political polarization creates a cycle where increased division leads to decreased trust, which in turn fuels further division and conflict, potentially impacting various aspects of society, from individual well-being to the functioning of democratic institutions. It is a vicious cycle, definitely. So, what can we do to lessen political polarization? We've touched on a few things already. Earlier, I mentioned that differences in political ideals and policy goals are indicators of a healthy democracy. So we need some difference of opinion. But too much distance between these differences and not being able to have a healthy discussion or civil discourse, which is what our episode 20 is going to be about. So not being able to have the healthy discussions about these differences causes polarization. This is not what the framers hoped for. We, the people, are the principal actors in our democratic republic. And the framers wanted empowered citizens, and we are empowered when we are informed. Our rights are protected, and fellow citizens and policymakers engage us in the democratic process. Fair processes respect the principle of one person, one vote. And policymaking institutions, such as Congress, are held accountable through checks and balances. So the policymakers are held accountable by the people and or the courts or the president. Responsive policy weighs all citizens' interests and values equally. And I wrote a note out to the side of that, gerrymandering and compromising. If we are calling in to our state legislators, for example, in Indiana, because they're still weighing whether they want to do new gerrymandered maps, they should be taking account of what a majority of people are asking them to do.
And if they do not, get them out of there.
Right. That should come over any pressure from the White House or the governor or anything else. Is what do the people want?
The people should be where it comes from, period.
And this provides for the common good and establishes institutions that empower individuals to protect their rights. So all citizens, not just the richest or the ones, like you said earlier, that are yelling the loudest, should benefit from the policies. We, the people, must push for elected representatives who share the sense of purpose and identity as part of we the people. We must elect leaders who recognized each other's right to have a voice or in the civil discourse or the political process and are willing to collaborate for common ends. That's why I said just a few minutes ago, we can't think, oh, I have to vote for that person because I'm a Republican and they're a Republican, or I'm a Democrat. It shouldn't be that way.
Absolutely
if they're not serving your interests, why would you vote for them?
And I think right now more than ever, we need candidates to step forward from either side of the aisle. And I'm even willing to say I'd consider somebody from the other party if they looked me in the eye and said, enough. Enough is enough. We're giving the voice back to the people, and I'm going to take my marching orders from my constituents. I would consider voting for that person.
And we're actually, in recent days, we've seen a few events of that. Now, whether it'll stick or not with certain people in Congress, who knows? Time will tell if it's just performative or do they really mean what they're saying. But
we've reached a moment, Bobbi, where something has to give.
Right.
It has to. We can't continue on like this, hating each other. We have to find that human connection, especially with the people that we don't agree with.
Right. So we must encourage our fellow citizens to get informed and get involved. We must demand collaboration and leaders with decent moral character. James Madison said in Federalist Number 39, and this is his quote, "We may define a republic as a government which derives all its power directly or indirectly from the great body of people, and is administered by persons holding their offices during pleasure, for a limited period, or during good behavior. It is essential to such a government that it be derived from the great body of society, not from an inconsiderable proportion or a favored class of it." End of his quote.
It's mic drop from the Federalist Papers.
Exactly. This discussion about polarization naturally leads into a discussion on civil discourse in America and how we can heal our democratic republic and have a healthy democracy as the framers had hoped for. I will end our discussion today with this quote from my favorite, Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address that I think is actually very relevant right now. Lincoln said, and this was towards the beginning of his address, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature."
We need our better angels. We need our better angels, just as they did back when Lincoln was speaking to a divided country. I encourage our better angels, and the better angels are in each of us.
Exactly. And this was given, and I'll point this out in the next episode, but Civil War hadn't started yet, but some southern states had seceded, and Lincoln knew that we were possibly headed towards a civil war.
So our nation is capable of finding its way. Again, we know that from history. We just need to put in the work and open our hearts.
We all need the better angels of our nature.
All right, so I think we're ready for the pop quiz.
Last episode's question, we elect a U.S. Senator to serve how many years? And the answer to that is 6 years. If you got that right, give yourself a pat on the back. This episode, I'm actually going to do 2 questions because one of the questions that follows up the U.S. Senator question, if you take the naturalization test, is they ask the test taker to name at least one of their state's U.S. senators. So I'm going to challenge our listeners to see if they can name one or both of their state's U.S. senators. And of course, since we have listeners from all over,
right,
you'll have to look that up on your own. But it's easy to do, just a Google search, you know, who is Minnesota's U.S. senator. I mean, you can find it that easy. But see if you can answer that, because we all should know who is serving us in not just our state legislature, but also in Congress. So here's the official pop quiz question this time. The House of Representatives has how many voting members?
Mm-hmm.
The House of Representatives has how many voting members?
When it's fully staffed. Mm-hmm. And you've mentioned this.
I have.
Very
because
recently.
It hasn't changed since the early 20th century.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think maybe one of the last episodes I talked about it.
You did. You talked about the total between the Senate, Congress as a whole. You gave that number. All right, so that's the pop quiz for this week. So at this time, it's time for us to name our next inductee into the Plain Civics Honor Roll.
So our next inductee, I actually know personally, but she has commented on our Facebook page about our podcast and encouraged people to watch it, and we are occasionally co-workers. Her name is Carolyn McDonald, and she lives in West Lafayette and is a retired teacher. So I thank you, Carolyn, for being a regular listener and promoting our podcast.
Absolutely. Carolyn McDonald, thank you. It personally means a lot to me that you've listened to our episodes. It personally touches me that you validate what we're doing here with your experience. That's a huge compliment. That's a motivator for us to continue moving forward. So we're very honored to add Carolyn McDonald's name to our honor roll. So thank you, Carolyn. So at this time, because of the nature of the content of the episode we did today, Bobbi, you have a special statement.
We had decided to do this episode on polarization before the killing of conservative influencer Charlie Kirk, but that violent incident has made this episode even more relevant because it served to expose what I see as the ugly truth about how polarized our nation is right now, all the way to the top. We look to our leaders to speak words of unity and healing, not words that accuse and further divide. The natural follow-up to an episode about political polarization is one about civil discourse, which our next episode is about. But that is 2 weeks from now. So let us end today with this. Be kind. Pause before commenting on social media. Don't believe everything you see or hear. Do your research. Listen. Be respectful. Remember that we are fellow Americans and should be friends, not enemies. Try to find the better angel of your nature.
Summon those better angels. Let's come together as a nation. We've been divided too long, and let's move forward arm in arm and find our patriotism, find the joy. Let's celebrate our differences, and let's give everyone's opinion the time it is due at the table. That is it for this episode of Plain Civics. Breaking down the basics, no politics, just facts. Thank you for listening. And until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.
This is Plain Civics. Join us for the journey as we break down the basics of how government works so you can make the government work for you.